talk about the Tales of Ise, what I don't quite understand what this is all about. A variant on the Tales of Ise rewritten for children. All will be revealed shortly. And our speaker this evening is Dr. Laura Moretti. It's very nice to have you here. I think it's the first time we've had the pleasure. But Laura is a lecturer in pre-modern Japanese studies at Cambridge University and a fellow of Emmanuel College. And she specialises in pre-modern, early modern Japanese literature. She's also one of the main specialists, I suppose, in this country, teaching people how to read the stuff, because it's quite squiggly, and it's pretty difficult to read unless you're specifically trained. And so Laura runs workshops and courses to train academics more broadly to be able to read this handwritten or woodblock printed Japanese literature. So I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and we'll have the PowerPoint up and try to unravel the mystery around this. No, this is okay. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for taking the time to come tonight. And today we'll talk about the Tales of Ise, Ise Monogatari. As you may know, it's a classic of Japanese court literature of the Heian period that has enjoyed the status of a canonical text from pretty much the 10th century onwards in Japan, and is now widely read in translation around the world. Now, the book Recasting the Past, an early modern Tales of Ise for children that I recently published with Brill, and today's talk approach the Tales of Ise from a non-canonical perspective by exploring an 18th century picture book that adapts the Tales of Ise for children. And I shall start my talk by sharing the serendipitous encounter with this material that was lying unresearched in archives. I then will discuss briefly the Tales of Ise with a focus on the early modern reception of this tale, to then move on to an introduction of the adaptation in question. And the talk will focus mainly on the intertextual strategies employed in the process of adaptation and on the nature of this picture book as a piece of children's literature. And I shall conclude by briefly describing how I conceived the book Recasting the Past and what the potential I see in it is. So this research project began thanks to really a fortuitous encounter made on a drizzly spring afternoon, as normally is in this country, in 2012 at the British Library. I accompanied a group of Cambridge students for a private viewing of early modern Japanese books, and my aim was to introduce them to the wide array of printed materials produced in the period and produced for a commercial market. When I talk about early modern Japan today, I refer to the period between the 17th century and the end of the 19th century, and I will call it early modern Japan or Edo period, but obviously you can also refer to it as Tokugawa period. Now, my preparations for that visit at the British Library included looking at examples of the popular literary genre known by the name of kusazoshi. They are cheap, illustrated, they're cheap picture books produced pretty much between the second half of the 17th century, very much into the Meiji period. I was immediately drawn to a volume that bound together half a dozen kusazoshi, which were originally part of the collection of the scholar diplomat Sir Ernest Satter. And going through that bound volume, I encountered this picture book. As you can see, I went through about 5 double pages spread, and I was immediately interested in this illustration. As you can see here, we have what, for anyone working on early modern, or actually pre-modern literature and visual culture, what is an iconic picture. This is actually a specific trope that triggered the connection with the Tales of Ise. We have a man with who is transporting the woman on his shoulder. He's looking behind him as if to check out whether he has been followed. And this actually is a connection with the sixth section of the Tales of Ise, and it is so iconic that it has been used over the centuries. Used by Kawarasu Tatsu for an album leaf produced in the first half of the 17th century. This is also, by the way, the cover of the most recent English translation of the Tales of Ise. It was used for the cover of one of the manga versions of the Tales of Ise in 1994. It was also used as the cover by Shimizu Yoshinori in one of his very sophisticated parodies of classics, Ise Monogatari, published in 1991. So you can imagine how a nerd of early modern literature like me got absolutely excited at finding that picture. In particular because I had been working at that point for quite some years on the reception history of the Tales of Ise. So what I do, I go back to the cover and I try to check the title slip, which is, as normally happens in early modern books, on the left side of the cover. And the title read, Ise fūryū, Utagaruta no hajimari, which I translated as the Fashionable Ise, the Origins of Utagaruta. And when I saw this title, a series of questions popped up in my mind. So is this picture book one of a number of texts that played intertextually with the Tales of Ise? And if that is the case, why didn't I find any reference to this picture book during my earlier work on the reconstruction of the reception history of the Tales of Ise? With these and other questions in mind, I glanced at the preface on the recto of the first volume. I will be honest with you, prefaces in early modern books often shed very little light on the book itself. Yet, luckily enough, this occasion proved different. And I would like to read the preface with you today. And I quote, "The Ise Monogatari, the Tales of Ise, has been titled as such, with the two characters, I and Se, connoting man and woman respectively, and meaning couple, because the tale of Narihira going to Ise as the imperial huntsman and exchanging love vows with the Ise shrine priestess is a truly intriguing story. This book, Utagaruta no hajimari, skillfully deals with Narihira writing about himself as the man of the past, mukashi otoparike, and as if he were a different person. It also adeptly handles the essence of the poems included in the Tales of Ise, as well as its poetic language, by rendering it all in a contemporary style, imayo, so that children can quickly grasp everything. With this in mind, we have requested drawings from the Torii School of Artists. We have called the book Utagaruta no hajimari, the origins of matching the first part of a poem with the second part, which refers to the poetic exchanges that serve as intermediaries in the love affairs of the men of the past." End quote. So in a nutshell, this preface tells us that Utagaruta no hajimari updates and repackages the Tales of Ise in such a way that it becomes an easy reading for children. It also tells us that this tale should be considered a story about love, and that poetry inserted in it works as an effective medium to enhance love between a man and a woman. So, hoping to unearth more, I went through the other books in the stack at the British Library. But sadly, the British Library only has one volume of what would have been a set of 2 or 3. At that point, my curiosity was piqued, and I was determined to find out more, and the result of the research journey that I undertook is the publication that I'm introducing to you today. Now, I'm sure that many of you in the audience are very familiar with the Tales of Ise, and I ask for your patience while I give some information to some of those of you who might not have had the pleasure to read this work yet. I will also provide you with some details about the reception history of the Tales of Ise in the Edo period, which I hope is something fresh for the majority of you. The Tales of Ise is normally described in history of Japanese literature as a fine example of uta monogatari. It is to say a work that combines combine a tale narrated in prose, monogatari, with waka poems in 31 syllables, waka, and more specifically, it does so in such a way that the prose is there to contextualize the poems. The date of composition is very much a matter of debate, though we certainly go back to the late 9th century, beginning of the 10th century. And the text went through different stages of composition. What we read today is actually based on a much later manuscript, the so-called Tenpuku manuscript, collected, edited by the scholar and poet Fujiwara no Teika in 1234. It looks like this. We have a facsimile published already in 1963 by Musashi no Shoei. Now, you can find a great deal of details about the composition of the Tales of Ise in English in the preface to the English translation published by Joshua Mostow and Royal Tyler. It's very, very good in terms of introducing the history of the Tales of Ise. Now, as we read it today, the Tales of Ise is composed of 125 pretty much independent episodes that are all connected by the presence of the same protagonist, the court poet Ariwara no Narihira. And the focus of the tale is on Narihira's amorous encounters with women within and outside the capital, subtly depicting the tension between the refinement of the capital and the rustic nature of the countryside. Now, the Tales of Ise did not wait long before becoming a canonical text that displays a complex and fascinating reception history. First, the tale circulated in a variety of illustrated hand scrolls as early as the mid-12th century, as an exhaustive survey conducted by the Research Center of Japanese Culture at Hagoromo University has shown. Starting from the beginning of the 17th century, the Tales of Ise was also put into print. And the first printed text is the elegant movable type edition known as the Sagabon that you can admire here in the copy housed at the Cambridge University Library. You can appreciate that the text is interspersed by illustrations. In 1629, the text is printed anew by using the woodblock medium. And from that date on, a plethora of editions were produced to be sold on the commercial book market. And in 2011, Yamamoto Tokuro has edited an extremely useful volume that collects all facsimiles of the major printed editions known to date. In the meanwhile, commentaries were also produced. They combine explanations of the poems and of specific words together with details about the biography of Narihira and the other protagonists of the tale. Now, interestingly enough, a handful of medieval commentaries studied by Susan Klein began to interpret the Tales of Ise as an esoteric text linked to Shingon Buddhism. And they began to see in the protagonist Narihira somebody born in Japan with a specific remit to guide human beings through the age of the degeneration of the Buddhist law by teaching enlightenment via sex. As you can imagine, at this point, the Tales of Ise and Narihira slowly began to be deeply connected to an erotic sphere. The tradition of commentaries continues to thrive in early modern times, and you can find here an example of a commentary that was published much later in 1680. Now, we have a copy here, so I'll pass it around. And you will appreciate that while the printed editions of the Tales of Ise combine text and illustrations, here we have a rather dry page layout full of text that probably appealed to those who wanted to study the Tales of Ise, of scholars of the Tales of Ise. Now, the Tales of Ise was depicted in early modern educational materials as a master reading for both men and women. And because of that, it became part of the canon of Japanese literature as soon as the Edo period. Now, because of this canonical status, we have, as soon as the beginning of the Edo period, a series of rewritings that can be placed between two poles. On the one hand, we have translations in modern Japanese at the time of the Tales of Ise. At the other extreme, we find minimal And in between, we find many variations, many different adaptations. And all these adaptations recast the past in such a way that it fits the contemporary society. And this process shows the desire to reappropriate the source text in such a way that it becomes understandable to an early modern reader with limited literacy, and that it appears in tune with the new cultural world of the Edo period Japan. When we teach Ise Monogatari to our students, they find it quite alien. And probably the Japanese in the room would agree that it's quite hard reading. But that was true already in the Edo period. And therefore they had to go through some process of adaptation in order to make the Tales of Ise understandable, agreeable, enjoyable for the early modern reader. Not very different from 21st century readers of the text. And the process of cultural appropriation continues outside the written world into arts and crafts inspired by the Tale of Ise, and these cultural products were presented in a fascinating exhibition that the Goto Museum put up in Tokyo a few years ago, and they are also discussed in English by the work of Joshua Moscow. Now, I would like to go back to the woodblock printed editions of the Tales of Ise, produced from 1629 onwards. As I mentioned, many are the editions available, and Yamamoto Tokuro has detected 57 different editions. Now, within 200 years, 57 different editions of a text, with many different impressions within each edition. That means it was pretty much a very popular text. And today I would like to show you a couple of examples just for you to get a feeling about how the Tales of Ise appeared in its materiality in the Edo period. For example, this one is a 1669 edition of the text. Unfortunately, I only have the second volume. If any of you has the first volume, do approach me after the talk. And it was published in Kyoto by Yamamoto Kyūzaemon, who was a publisher known for his jewelry theatre librettos. Now, the text was issued in a very big format. This is a very big format. It's known as Obon. And as you can see, each of the 125 episodes are marked by a number on top of the page. The text is interspersed with illustration, very much in the tradition of the Sagabon edition. This is a later edition, a 1698 edition, entitled Ise Monogatari Taisei, published both in Kyoto and Edo. And as you can see, it offers a much more sophisticated page layout. I'm going to circulate these texts. How sophisticated? First of all, the text of the Tales of Ise is included in the 2/3 part of the bottom part of the page. And the main text is written in big fonts, and next to it you have printed some glosses, and the glosses will tell you who the characters are, and at the same time will explain you terms which are particularly difficult for a 1698 readers. You still have illustrations within the text. Interestingly enough, the text now is printed within the illustration, and on top of it you find other textual materials, synopsis of the Tales of Genji, for example. You have a part from poetic anthologies of waka. So what happens in this edition of the Tales of Ise, we still have the Tales of Ise, but it becomes a text, a rich reading material meant to be useful for those who wanted to become very apt in the way of poetry. In both these examples, the text is written in a combination, in a mixture of phonetic signs of hiragana and of logographic characters, of kanji. And this means that the reader needed a certain degree of proficiency in reading a wide pool of kanji in order to access and to understand the Tales of Ise. So we have seen that the Tales of Ise was circulating massively throughout the centuries with manuscript, illustrated scrolls, printed editions, commentaries, intralingual translations, and parodies. This shows that by the time we reach 1766, which is the time of publication of the little picture book I found at the British Library and that we are talking about today, the Tales of Ise was an important part of the cultural encyclopedia of the early modern Japanese people across genders, for both males and females. And for those who would like to read the Tales of Ise in translation, it might be useful to know that there are 4 English translations. Now let us move on to Utagaruta no Hajimari. The text survives only in 2 complete copies, one housed at the National Institute of Japanese Literature and the other at the Daitokyu Bunko in the Goto Museum, both in Tokyo. As mentioned before, the British Library copy has only 1 volume out of 3, but it is nonetheless a very important copy, as it is the only one to retain the cover of the first volume in its entirety, and we shall see that the cover is very important to reconstruct the publication history of this little picture book. Now, you must imagine that the size of this picture book is very different from the size of the printed versions of the Tales of Ise. This is an oval. This is, if I had the original of Utagaruta no Hajimari with me, how it would look like. This is called Chuban, is pretty much 18 centimeters height, 13 length, and it is a pocketbook. And size matters. It matters to give an impression of something that is more serious and something which is more entertaining. This format is also typical of the kusazoshi that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk as a form of cheap illustrated books, more specifically picture books. As the other kusazoshi, Utagaruta no Hajimari was printed on recycled paper. And it is said by Edo period writers that that paper had a very pungent odor, a very pungent smell, that made people refer to these books as kusai, smelly. Therefore, kusa, kusai, soshi booklets. At least this is one of the theories produced in the Edo period about the name of this genre. Now, Utagaruta no Hajimari is composed of 3 volumes of 5 folios each. If you look at, and I have quite a few examples of kusazoshi here, so you can go through them. Recycled paper, they're not smelly anymore, unfortunately. There are some scholars who have tried to, apparently, tried very hard to detect the smell. And as you can see, we have 1 folio, 2 folio, up to 15. And that was pretty much the format of kusazoshi. Apart from the introduction that we have seen a picture of, which has no illustration, each double-page spread would combine text and images. It pretty much looks like this. And as you can see from this slide, the text is a composite entity which is made of narration in blue in the slide, which is divided in short passages sprinkled through the illustrations. It's made of dialogues in green, which are randomly inserted with little concern for placement next to the character they are uttered by. 31 Japanese poems, waka in pink, indications of what action is unfolding in front of our eyes in yellow, and the names of the characters in red. Now you can appreciate that when you read this material, you have to train your eye in a different way. It's not reading from right to left, it's jumping. And when you transcribe and translate, the order that you decide to use is already an interpretation of how the text was read, should be read. The text is 99% written in phonetic signs, in hiragana only. The only logographic characters, kanji, that are employed are those that an early modern Japanese would have learned at the beginning of his or her education in a Terakoya school, namely kanji for names, place names, and numbers. And that means that the level of literacy required to read this material is much less demanding than the one required to read a printed text of the Tales of Ise at the same time, produced at the same time. Now, the copy housed at the National Institute of Japanese Literature presents a crisper printed surface compared to the Goto Museum copy, and it shows the presence of color added by hand. In the book, Recasting the Past, I discussed how this type of cheap publication has been compared with Western chapbooks on the basis of their similarity from the bibliographic point of view. This is an example of a chapbook which was produced in this country, in Britain, and this is a kusazoshi. I discussed the merits of comparing the similarities between these two products of early modern culture, but at the same time, I also point out that it might be dangerous to highlight only similarities between these two products. Now, kusazoshi, and Utagaruta no hajimari is no exception, did not include any colophon at the end of the book. Normally, when we look at these books, early modern books, we always jump at the end of the first thing to see if there is a colophon, to see if there is information about who produced this book, where it was produced, when it was produced. Now, kusazoshi do not have a colophon. Nonetheless, they do have information about the publishers. And the information is given by the crest. The crest of the publisher would normally be printed on the title sleeve. You now appreciate why the cover of the British Library copy is so important. You can see the crest of the publisher here, and the crest will also be published on the first folio of each volume. Now, this shape is a shape with 3 fish scales, and it is connected with this publisher, Uroko Gataya. Now, Uroko Gataya, we know how he looked like because we have this image of his shop. And this is how his shop would have looked like around the time of publication of Utagaruta no hajimari. This is included in a kusazoshi that Uroko Gataya publishes, pretty much bragging off about how good he is in producing kusazoshi. It's a kind of publicity material. And in the book, I go into quite some length in introducing this other kusazoshi as well. But for today, I would like you to appreciate how his shop was organized. We have a noren, we have a curtain that has the same crest, we have a signboard with his name, and also tells us that he was a soshi toya, he was a bookseller of cheap, entertaining products, like the one we are reading, but he was also a hontoya, a publisher of serious materials. He is sitting behind a desk with a stack of books in front of him, the ledger, the account book in front of him, and he's advertising his latest kusazoshi, and this one is what we are reading at the moment. The Uroko Gataya family had a very successful business as early as the middle of the 17th century. Across 3 generations, Uroko Gataya produced guidebooks to the pleasure porter, Yoshiwara. They produced reprints of popular text originally published in Kyoto and for which there was great demand, sort of pirate editions of what was going on in Kansai. Books illustrated by the celebrated artist Hishikawa Moronobu. New editions of medieval war tales, librettos for the Jodori theatre, and, of course, kusazoshi. Actually, the 3rd generation, Uroko Gataya Magobe, this chap over here, was particularly famous for his kusazoshi. And Utagaruta no hajimari is the product of this very successful business enterprise. From contextual evidence, we know that Uroko Gataya was very successful in marketing and selling his kusazoshi. But how can we judge whether Utagaruta no hajimari sold? Once more, the Uroko Gataya crest is revealing. It appears in both the British Library copy and in the National Institute of Japanese Literature copy, but it is missing in the Goto Museum copy. Now, this detail, together with the lower quality of the printing that I've mentioned before, suggests something important about Utagaruta no hajimari. First, the woodblocks were printed many times to the point that the abrasion of the wood would not allow any crisp result anymore. Second, the set of woodblock was probably sold to another bookseller, which once more is an indication, albeit indirect, of the popularity of this book. The fact that only 2 copies have survived is not meaningful at all when we look at early modern Japanese books. The supplementary title, Ise fūryū, the fashionable Ise, as I already mentioned, alerts the reader to the fact that we have an adaptation of the Tales of Ise. So the question is, how does Utagaruta no hajimari appropriate the Tales of Ise? The first thing to note is that it offers a digest version of the source text by selecting 13 sections out of the 125 sections of the source text. The choice of these sections means that the account of Narihira's love affairs are comparatively restricted in number, with a focus on the amorous episodes with 3 women. There is also mention of 4 other women, but they are not really central to the text. The selection of a limited number of episodes allows a relatively long text to fit into the small size 15 folios format, typical of kusazoshi. You had to cram everything within 15 folios, that was the point. At the same time, this makes the text snappier and potentially more attractive to a wide range of readers, including children. But this is not all. Another result achieved by the selection is the creation of a story that is less fragmented and that actually works better as one story. This is also true within each of the love stories narrated, and I'd like you to introduce the love story with Princess Nijo as an example today. In the Tales of Ise, the love story begins with Narihira, who is visiting the East Fifth Ward residence where the Nijo princess lives, and he gains access through a breach in the exterior wall guarded by sentinels. This happens in section 5. It continues with Narihira's failed attempt to run away with the princess, the iconic image that we saw at the beginning of my talk, and this is section 6. But then you have to wait to section 65 in order to see how the story evolves, namely that Narihira tries to overcome his feelings, and that the woman is imprisoned in a storehouse, and therefore they can't meet anymore. Now, Utagaruta rearranges the order of the events and combines these 3 sections into one long episode that covers 2 double-page spreads and an additional half folio. We find ourselves in media res with Narihira abducting the Princess Nijo and trying to run away with her. Then the story moves back in time, a time shift that is indicated by the use of this cloud-shaped line. And we go back in time to when Narihira is trying to break into the residence of the woman through a hole in the wall. Then the story fast forwards to the moment when the princess is taken back home by her brothers, and we find Narihira alone, crying because of the loss of the woman. And finally, we move to the end of the story with the woman being imprisoned in a storehouse, with Narihira trying to alert her of his presence by playing the flute, and it is only at the end that he tries to overcome his feelings by having some sort of rituals performed before his brother Yukihira. So as we have seen so far, Utagaruta no hajimari turns the Tales of Ise into a shorter and more coherent story. So the next question is whether this is achieved by simply copy-pasting the selected sections of the Tales of Ise, or whether there is a more complex process of adaptation involved. the only passages that are quoted verbatim without any change is poetry. We get a feeling that poetic language was something revered as a fixed entity and that was not subject or could not be subject to any rephrasing. Conversely, there appears to have been no anxiety in altering the prose whatsoever. Small modifications actually proliferate throughout the text to make the prose text more easily accessible to an Edo period reader. In Recasting the Past, I discuss 4 types of intertextual techniques applied in Utagaruta no hajimari, but today I shall introduce only the updating via the use of anachronism. I would like to point out, though, that the first 3 adaptation techniques all share a common attitude in the sense that they try to retell the tale in contemporary language and contemporary fashion, the imayo that was announced to be used in the preface. The example of anachronism can be seen in this scene. And I will read the English translation. So I'll read. Kino Aitsune's daughter, Izutsu no Mae and Narihira were an affectionate couple. As the years passed, he must have had thought that she was not as special as she once was. Unfortunately, Narihira began to visit a young girl of Koitaya in Tagayasu County in Kawachi province. Now, in the Tales of Ise, she has no names. All the women here have a narrative identity, which I find very interesting as well. And I go back to the text. This low-class prostitute, Kawatake no Onna, was out of the ordinary. Her makeup of rouge and white powder stood out, and Narihira continued to see her regularly. Now, here the text says the young girl of Koitaya, here is Narihira, and her words are here saying Mata kianshita, which is the typical way that prostitutes used to speak in the Edo period. Now, Narihira's mistress in Kawachi is pictured here as a Kawatake no Onna, a woman of the river and bamboo, a euphemistic term for kamigata prostitutes working outside the licensed pleasure quarters. Now, this term was especially in vogue in the 1780s, but of course the use of it in Utagaruta Monogatari, Utagaruta no Hajimari, published in 1766, alerts us that the term was already in use in this time. But more importantly, you might appreciate that in the 10th century, which is the temporal setting of the Tales of Ise, there was no licensed pleasure quarters. Therefore, there were no Kawatake no Onna. And this is a way for the adaptation to make easily understandable how, what identity the mistress that Narihira visits in this area, what her identity was. The woman's makeup, lip rouge and white face powder further underscores the updating because these were modish when Utagaruta no Hajimari was published. So everything is updated to make the reader feel, oh, actually it is a story that is still actual, that I can relate to quite easily. And in the book I discuss other instances of this kind of updating. Now, the changes to the prose of the Tales of Ise, though, are not limited to linguistic adjustments into modern Japanese. The text, in fact, also adds new passages with an entirely different flavor. The beginning and the end of the tale stands out as fresh materials. While the Tales of Ise starts with Narihira having entered adulthood, Utagaruta no Hajimari introduces Narihira as a young boy, and I will talk a little bit more about this passage in due course. And while the Tales of Ise ends with the death of Narihira, Utagaruta no Hajimari lightens the dramatic mode of the tale by adding an auspicious finale. And I read. Narihira's younger sister, Wakakusa no Mae, married Fujiwara no Toshiyuki. They were deeply in love and had many children. We have the names of the protagonists, and then Ariwara no Narihira was reborn as a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Kan. He reappeared temporarily in this world in order to save human beings lost and tainted by the 5 impurities. He saves women from sins caused by lustful sins. Now, this happy ending fits with the nature of kusazoshi as light-hearted prose published at the new year. You read something at the new year, you do not want something that puts you into depression for the rest of the year. You want something which ends in an auspicious manner. You don't want Narihira to die, you want something else. What more propitious conclusion could there be than having Narihira's beloved sister wed a famous court poet and Narihira becoming a divine being? Now, the penultimate scene is also revealing. It is not completely fresh material, as it borrowed section 120 from the Tales of Ise, but it is enlarged to read as a funny story, in the spirit of the many jest books, so books of jokes, that were abounding at the time. And I'll take a little time to read for you this story while you look at the picture. And as you can see, the two women here are those which are put on the cover. Had a lot of discussions about the cover, but in any case. So I'll read. In the past, our man heard that a woman, whom he thought still innocent, still a virgin, was in fact involved with someone. After a while, he wrote, here's the poem, "Let them now begin the Tsukuma festival, Omi province loves, for I would see how many pots crown your girlish innocence." Now, the Tales of Ise stops here. Our story goes on. We are in the Tsukuma shrine, and then the text says, "The meaning of the poem above is as follows. There was a young girl who appeared quite unknowledgeable about worldly affairs. It came to light that she had a lover who she visited in secret. This poem reveals how shocked people were about this. There is a shrine known as Tsukuma at a place called Asazuma in the county of Sakata in Omi province. The main festival takes place on the Day of the Horse in the 4th month. And the festival, by the way, is still performed nowadays. The women of this village make the same number of earthen pots as their sexual liaisons with men, carry these pots on their head, and then present them to the gods. In the past, one woman felt embarrassed about how many lovers she had, and instead carried one large pot on her head. She had made small pots, equaling the numbers of her lovers, and put these inside the big pot. The woman who concealed the number of her lovers by placing smaller pots into a larger one went against the will of the gods. As a consequence, she stumbled in the middle of the ground, and the small pot broke, spilling out of the bigger vessel. As a result, her disgrace was even greater. And we have her words, "Oh no, I've fallen down." So to recap, the Utagaruta no hajimari molds the, molds the Tales of Ise for it to become a short, coherent story, which depicts Ariwara no Narihira's life from when he was a young boy to when he was reborn as a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Kami. The language of the prose is changed in such a way that all sorts of readers with no knowledge of Heian period Japanese and with basic hiragana literacy could easily access it. And the combination of text and image make the reading experience more enjoyable. Now let's now consider very briefly Utagaruta no hajimari as a piece of children's literature. Let's go back to the opening scene. We can appreciate that Narihira is portrayed as a young boy. His hairstyle indicates that he is of an age, that he's still young. His name is Mandaramari. His hairstyle, as I said, accords to this young specific age, the young age specified in the text. Now the setting is that of an early modern Japanese Terakoya school, a type of school for primary education, with Narihira and other pupils seated at their desks. You have writing implements, and inkstone and paper in front of them. Now you can appreciate from, this image of a Terakoya school taken from Ehon Fude Tsubana a little bit earlier, 1746, that the setting really recalls that of a school. So it can be argued that the choice to depict Narihira as a young boy in a school would have encouraged a young reader to identify himself with the main character. In other words, as a child practicing writing at school. From this point of view, the addition of this fresh material at the beginning of the text allowed to market Utagaruta no Hajimari as a book geared for children. Children would open it and think, oh, it's the same as me. It should be clear by now that Utagaruta no Hajimari adapts a tale for adults into something suitable for children. Now, from this point of view, it does not differ from the Western counterparts as studied by scholars like Anja Müller and Laura Tosi. After discussing research done on Western adaptations for children of adults literature, in Recasting the Past, I argue that as a book for children, Utagaruta served three purposes. The first was educational. Young readers were introduced to the text of the Tales of Ise, which was part of the literary canon by the early 17th century, as we have already seen, and therefore they were able to share in a common cultural heritage. The second was aesthetic. By leaving the waka poems in their original format and language without alteration or annotation, children were invited to appreciate the poetic language still considered at the time to be an integral part of a sound education. The third was practical. Now, Aya Fujishima has shown that illustrated playing cards of the Tales of Ise, Utagaruta playing cards, were actually existing in the Edo period. So the inclusion of poems verbatim from the Tales of Ise would have allowed children to memorize some of these poems and therefore to play the guard game. Still, the limited number of poems is a little bit puzzling, so that's something to be thought a little bit more in depth. In my publication, I also discuss how Utagaruta no Hajimari shows a facet that cannot be found in Western examples of adaptations for children of adults literature. In the case of Western examples, scholars talk a great deal about a process of sanitation of adults literature, in line with the concept that children are vulnerable and must be protected from morally harmful or traumatic materials like sex, violence, crime, extreme suffering. Now, Utagaruta no Hajimari does not shield the child from the world of the adults, and in particular from the reference to sex in the world of the adults. A few years ago, and I'm very glad that we have Professor Gerstel here, we had a wonderful, we managed to see a wonderful exhibition at the British Museum of Shunga, and we saw the presence of children within Shunga pictures. Whether that was real or not was a matter of debate, but still sex was part of the life of children. And Utagaruta no Hajimari does not attempt in any way to take away reference, direct or indirect, to sex. It is true to say it's not a shunpon, there's no portrayal of sex in this, but at the same time, we're not shying away from mentioning sex. It can be argued that the allusions to the world of love and sexual intimacy suggest that the text also sought to educate children about this aspect of life and what awaits them in adulthood. The realization that no process of sanitation is to be found in Utagaruta no Hajimari is important from at least one viewpoint. Handbooks on children's literature and academic studies normally focus on Western examples, both early modern and modern. They offer a uniform explanations of what children's literature is. However, when we move away from the West, we encounter a very different textual phenomenon that forces us to rethink what children's literature is, in what characterizes it, and what the concept of childhood entails. So studying Japan is actually very important to give contribution to disciplines, to the theoretical discourse in other disciplines, and often, too often, that theoretical discourse is molded on Western examples, case studies only. A final note of caution is necessary at this point. While Utagaruta no Hajimari openly targeted children and therefore cannot not be considered literature for children, nothing prohibited the adult reader to enjoy Utagaruta no Hajimari as a substitute for the Tales of Ise. If you had no time or the education to access the Heian period tale in its early modern commercially printed books? Well, you could learn about it by reading this easy, snappy, illustrated digest version. And this scene is from a later kusazoshi, and you can, I'm very sorry about the bad quality, but you can see a child browsing through kusazoshi and a man reading avidly one of them. It's quite hard to find images of children's reading, and maybe Dr. Williams, who is in the room, who has worked a great deal on children's literature in the Edo period, can help us out on that point of view. Now, I'd like to conclude, and I'm aware I've been talking for 51 minutes, to conclude my talk with a few words about the book, Recasting the Past. I was really very lucky that Brill, in the person of Inge Klopsmakers, has responded enthusiastically to a project that was technically very challenging. And it was challenging because the book not only offers a study of Utagaruta no hajimari, and today I gave you just a synopsis of the contents of the first section, but also provides the reader with fully color reproductions of the original text, its transcription in modern Japanese script, and the English translation. Now, to my knowledge, and I might be very wrong, I very often am, to my knowledge, this is the first attempt to publish a book that contains the diplomatic transcription of an unresearched primary source together with an English translation outside the Japanese publishing world. Professor Drew Gerster has published wonderful books with Nichibun Ken. It is quite challenging to find examples of this published in the West. Now, the reason lies in the fact that until our generation, engagement with the original printed text in cursive Japanese and with variants of hiragana that are not extant to date was simply not possible. The production of transcriptions was perceived as a scholarly activity for Japanese scholars. It is with our generation that we are beginning to have Western scholars who have been trained in Japan to deal with the original texts. And for me, the publication of a diplomatic transcription of a text like Utagaruta no hajimari is even more meaningful because in Cambridge we are one of the very few centres in the UK and in Europe that teaches how to decode cursive Japanese script. The main activity, I'm sorry to do some publicity, that we run from this point of view is a 2-week intensive graduate summer school that Jason kindly mentioned at the beginning. And each year we gather graduate students and scholars from around the world to learn how to access and transcribe early modern texts. So Recasting the Past showcases that this scholarly endeavor is now possible for Western scholars, and that it leads to the exploration of uncharted territory outside the canon of Japanese literature. And it is my hope that it can also be used to start learning how to study early modern Japanese paleography. Now, Brill is now thinking about a series. We are talking now about the possibility of 6 titles. We have found 6 scholars who are willing to contribute. And the idea is to introduce readers to other non-canonical Edo period texts that shed important and interesting light on important and interesting cultural and literary phenomena. Now, Recasting the Past in its little world does so by completing the fragmentary puzzle of the reception and history of the Tales of Ise in the Edo period by presenting for the first time a text like Utagaruta no hajimari that adapts the source text in the picture book format for children, and not only. And I would like to conclude my talk with some drawings that have been made by a young British artist, Molly Andrews. These drawings have been inspired by Utagaruta no hajimari. As much as the Tales of Ise had the power to spark the production of all sorts of books and artistic products for centuries, so does Utagaruta no hajimari in 21st century Britain. In the hope that this talk might have awoken your curiosity to know more about the Tales of Ise and about this early modern picture book that recasts the past, I'd like to conclude my talk.